From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
We conclude that there is reasonable cause to believe that BPD engages in a pattern or practice of conduct that violates the Constitution and federal anti-discrimination law. BPD engages in a pattern or practice of making unconstitutional stops, searches, and arrests, using enforcement strategies that produce severe and unjustified disparities in the rates of stops, searches, and arrests of African Americans.
The Justice Department issues a scathing report about the Baltimore Police Department, exposing systemic racism and the routine use of excessive force, largely targeting the city's African-American population. We'll go to Baltimore for the latest. Then inside the Fox News bunker.
Fox News is undergoing something of an existential crisis. They are without the leader that founded the organization, Roger Ailes, who is embroiled in the largest sexual harassment scandal that we can think of, and who knows where it's going to end.
We'll speak with Vanity Fair's Sarah Ellison about Roger Ailes and the future of Fox News. She recently exposed the existence of explosive audio tapes recorded by multiple women in conversation with Ailes. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. An official from the U.S. Secret Service has confirmed the agency's spoken to the Trump campaign about his comments at a rally in Wilmington, North Carolina, Tuesday, which many saw as a call to assassinate his rival, Hillary Clinton.
Hillary wants to essentially abolish the Second Amendment. By the way, and if she gets to pick her judges, nothing you can do, folks. Although the Second Amendment people, maybe there is, I don't know. But
the official told CNN the Secret Service has had multiple conversations with the campaign over the comments. Donald Trump, however, is denying these conversations with the Secret Service have taken place, tweeting, quote, "No such meeting or conversation ever happened," unquote. This comes as Hillary Clinton has spoken out about Trump's comments during a rally in Des Moines, Iowa, Wednesday.
Yesterday, we witnessed the latest in a long line of casual comments from Donald Trump that cross the line. His casual cruelty to a Gold Star family. His casual suggestion that more countries should have nuclear weapons. And now his casual inciting of violence. Every single one of these incidents shows us that Donald Trump simply does not have the temperament to be President and Commander-in-Chief of the United States.
Green Party presidential nominee Dr. Jill Stein has also addressed Trump's comments, tweeting, quote, "Gun violence is no laughing matter. We need a president who understands it's not funny to call on people to shoot opponents. Disarm Trump," she tweeted. Trump, however, has denied the comments were a call to assassinate Hillary Clinton. On Tuesday, his campaign issued a statement saying he was referring to the Second Amendment supporters' quote, "amazing spirit and great political power," unquote. Meanwhile, Hillary Clinton's embraced her recent endorsement by John Negroponte, the former director of national intelligence. President George W. Bush's official also served as U.S. ambassador to Honduras, which was the staging ground for the U.S.-backed Contras in Nicaragua. Hillary Clinton has faced questions on the campaign trail about her own role in Honduras much later as Secretary of State, including legitimizing the 2009 coup in Honduras. The Clinton campaign is continuing to face questions following the release of 44 State Department emails showing close ties between the Clinton Foundation and the State Department during Clinton's time as Secretary of State. The emails include communications between top members of the Clinton Foundation and Clinton's top State Department advisors, including Huma Abedin and lawyer Cheryl Mills. One of the communications was about billionaire Nigerian-based developer Gilbert Chagoury, who'd contributed between $1 and $5 million to the Clinton Foundation. The emails show a top Clinton Foundation executive writing to Abedin and Mills asking for help putting Chagoury in touch with the U.S. ambassador to Lebanon. Abedin responded, "I'll talk to Jeff," referring to then U.S. Ambassador Jeffrey Feltman. On Wednesday, Chagoury's spokesman said Chagoury, quote, "was simply passing along his observations and insights about the dire political situation in Lebanon at the time," unquote. In Florida, police fatally shot a In Florida, police fatally shot a 73-year-old white woman during a police training exercise at the Punta Gorda Public Safety Complex Wednesday. The officer who fired the gun thought it was loaded with blanks. Mary Knowlton was a retired librarian and mother of two. She'd volunteered to participate in a shoot, don't shoot exercise as part of the Citizen Police Academy. During the exercise, police officer Lee Cole shot the librarian in front of nearly 36 other volunteers. Punta Gorda Police Chief Tom Lewis says live ammunition was not supposed to be in any of the guns used during the exercise. This is Mary Knowlton's son, Steve Knowlton.
It was surreal. He just said, at first we thought she just fell down, and then they turned her over, and that's when they saw the bullet holes. Total pandemonium. They were just trying to do CPR and keep her alive.
Officer Lee Cole has been placed on paid administrative leave. Meanwhile, in Los Angeles, community members held a vigil to mourn the death of 14-year-old Mexican-American Jesse Romero, who was killed by police Wednesday. Police say they were responding to a call about teenagers writing graffiti in the L.A. neighborhood of Boyle Heights. Police say they shot and killed Romero after he ran away from police and fired a gun, but witnesses have a different story. One woman told the Los Angeles Times she saw Romero toss a handgun toward a fence while he was running away from the police. She says the gun went off when it hit the ground. She says she then heard 2 gunshots, saw Romero fall to the ground, and watched the police handcuff him. Police say the officers were wearing body cameras, but the video has not yet been released. This is Romero's friend, Johanna Miranda.
Come on, why would you shoot him if he didn't even point at you guys? He didn't do nothing. Like, aren't you guys trained to do your job right? Shouldn't you guys tackle him down if he's not shooting you guys? He didn't point a gun at them. Why would he shoot? This kid was only 14 years old.
Jesse Romero was a student at Hollenbach Middle School. He would have turned 15 on August 24th. In Raleigh, North Carolina, a white man who claimed he was on a neighborhood watch shot and killed a 20-year-old African-American man after telling the 911 dispatcher, quote, "We got a bunch of hoodlums out here racing. I'm going outside to secure my neighborhood," unquote. Police say Chad Copley shot and killed 20-year-old Corinne Rodney Bernard Thomas from inside his garage as Thomas was walking home from a party Sunday. Copley has been charged with first-degree murder. The case recalls the killing of African-American teenager Trayvon Martin by Neighborhood Watch vigilante George Zimmerman. In Missouri, lawyers have sued 13 St. Louis area cities, arguing the cities are violating poor citizens' rights by locking them in jail over minor traffic violations. The lawsuit was filed on the 2nd anniversary of the police killing of Michael Brown, the unarmed 18-year-old African-American who was killed by white police officer Darren Wilson in the St. Louis suburb of Ferguson. The lawsuit argues the cities are operating a, quote, modern-day police state and debtors' prison scheme that has no place in American society today, unquote. It was filed on behalf of 13 people, one of whom was locked up in squalid conditions in jail for days over a parking ticket. In international news, at least 8 people were killed in 2 separate bomb attacks in southern Turkey. Officials have blamed the Kurdistan Workers' Party, known as the PKK, for the attacks. This comes as Turkish authorities have arrested at least 17 people in raids in Istanbul. Officials say the raids are targeting suspected terrorists, but media reports say the headquarters of the leftist pro-Kurdish People's Democratic Party, known as the HDP, was also raided by police during the operation. Meanwhile, Turkish President Erdogan has reiterated his calls for the United States to extradite the Turkish cleric Fethullah Gulen, who's living in Pennsylvania and the Poconos. Erdogan has accused Gulen of masterminding the failed coup, which Gulen denies. Newly declassified State Department documents are shedding new light on the relationship between former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and Argentina's military dictatorship, which ruled Argentina from 1976 to 83. The documents show how Kissinger thwarted the State Department's efforts to stop the mass killings by instead praising Argentina's military leaders in 1978, saying, quote, the government of Argentina had done an outstanding job in wiping out terrorist forces, unquote. Kissinger made the comments while visiting Argentina for the 1978 World Cup as a personal guest of the junta leader, General Jorge Videla, who presided over the disappearance of as many as 30,000 people. In one of the newly released cables, National Security Council official Robert Pastor wrote, quote, Kissinger's praise for the Argentine government in its campaign against terrorism was the music the Argentine government was longing to hear, unquote. Laura Poitras and more than 40 other documentarians are calling on the Justice Department to investigate the targeting and harassment of citizen journalists who film police violence. The group includes 8 Oscar winners. Laura Poitras won her Oscar for the documentary about Edward Snowden called Citizen 4. The letter, titled Right to Record, highlights that the bystanders who filmed the police killings of Alton Sterling, Philando Castile, and Eric Garner were all subsequently arrested. In Wisconsin, an appeals court has suspended a July ruling that struck down parts of Wisconsin's voter ID law. Under the earlier July 19th ruling, Wisconsin voters would be able to vote in November even if they don't have the IDs required by the restrictive law. But this new appeals court ruling suspends that ruling, once again making it harder for people to vote in November's general election. In Texas, a transgender woman was killed Monday inside an apartment building in El Paso. Erica Tijerina was 36 years old. Police say they are investigating her death as a homicide. Her family says they believe her killing may have been a hate crime. At least 16 transgender people have been murdered this year, following a record of more than 20 killings in 2015. In India, human rights activist Iram Sharmila has ended the world's longest hunger strike. Sharmila began her strike 16 years ago after 10 people were reportedly killed by a government paramilitary group in her home state of Manipur. She broke her strike Tuesday with a lick of honey. She says she will now run to be chief minister of Manipur. This is Sharmila speaking to the BBC after breaking her fast.
Since the beginning of my fast, there is no change in the mindset of the people. I think I need to change my strategy. And without power in my hands, who will hear my voice?
Iram Sharmila is known as the Iron Lady. And here in New York City, a 20-year-old Virginia man scaled the side of the Trump Tower using industrial-grade suction cups and rope and harness Wednesday. The man, who's a Trump supporter, said his goal was to reach the top of the iconic tower and ask for a personal meeting with Donald Trump. After an hours-long standoff, the police pulled him through a window on the 21st floor and took him to Bellevue Hospital. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. A Justice Department investigation has concluded Baltimore police have carried out a practice of racially discriminatory policing by systematically stopping, searching, and arresting black residents at a disproportionate rate. Deputy Assistant U.S. Attorney General Vanita Gupta outlined the findings at a news conference in Baltimore Wednesday.
We conclude that there is reasonable cause to believe that BPD engages in a pattern or practice of conduct that violates the Constitution and federal anti-discrimination law. BPD engages in a pattern or practice of making unconstitutional stops, searches, and arrests, using enforcement strategies that produce severe and unjustified disparities in the rates of stops, searches, and arrests of African Americans, using excessive force, and retaliating against people engaging in constitutionally protected expression. These violations have deeply eroded the mutual trust between BPD and the community it serves, trust that is essential to effective policing as well as to officer and public safety. The problems in Baltimore didn't happen overnight or appear in a day. The pattern or practice that we found results from long-standing systemic deficiencies in the BPD.
The Justice Department launched the investigation following the death of Freddie Gray, who died in 2015 of spinal injuries sustained in police custody. Although charges were brought against 6 police officers over Gray's arrest and death, none has been convicted and all remaining charges have been dropped. Deputy Assistant U.S. Attorney General Vanita Gupta outlined how African Americans are routinely targeted in Baltimore.
The city's African-American residents and African-American neighborhoods bore the brunt of this activity. Out of the data we surveyed, the police department made roughly 44% of its stops in 2 small, predominantly African-American districts that contain only 11% of the city's population. African Americans accounted for 95% of the 410 individuals the police department stopped at least 10 times. Indeed, one African-American man was stopped 30 times in less than 4 years, with none of the stops resulting in a citation or a criminal charge. We also found a pattern or practice of excessive force. For example, officers frequently resorted to physical force when a person did not immediately respond to verbal commands, even where the person was posing no imminent threat to the officer or others. Officers were ending up in unnecessarily violent confrontations with people in with mental health disabilities. We have seen communities throughout the country that improved policies and enhanced training and de-escalation and dealing with people in crisis can actually enhance officer safety and reduce the need for force. BPD also violates the First Amendment by retaliating against individuals engaged in constitutionally protected activities. Officers frequently detain and arrest members of the public for engaging in speech that officers perceive to be critical or disrespectful. And BPD officers use force against members of the public who are engaging in protected speech.
The 163-page report said, quote, supervisors have issued explicitly discriminatory orders, such as directing a shift to arrest all the black hoodies in a neighborhood, unquote. The DOJ also found Baltimore police use unreasonable force against juveniles and people with mental health disabilities. Officers also showed gender bias in handling sexual assault investigations. For more, we're joined by two guests. Baynard Woods is a freelance journalist who writes for The Guardian. His recent article is headlined, "To Baltimore's DOJ Investigation into Police Finds Vast Racial Disparity." He's editor-at-large for the Baltimore City paper. And Ralik Hayes, activist and coordinator of Baltimore Block, a grassroots collective. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Let's begin with Baynard. Can you lay out these findings that the Justice Department has just released in this 163-page report?
Sure. I mean, it's a really striking. On the one hand, it's what everyone and especially Baltimore's black residents have been saying, but the specificity of the data that was collected by the Department of Justice in the specific targeting of African-American neighborhoods, which goes back to the city's segregation that because the city is so segregated, by targeting certain neighborhoods, they're also targeting certain populations, specifically the city's black population. And so you just have these vast, as we were just hearing, these vast discrepancies of more than 80% of all pedestrian stops are of African Americans, 95% of all of the stops, of all of the people stopped more than 10 times while driving. And so you see these, and the Department of Justice is very clear in linking it back to the city's zero-tolerance policy, which was set out to clear corners. And many of the mid-level supervisors who were trained in that period are still directing their officers to behave in such a way. And so that single decision or series of decisions has these wide-ranging consequences that you were just talking about.
Baynard, can you explain what a Terry stop is?
Yeah, so a Terry stop is the Terry versus Ohio, comes from the Terry versus Ohio Supreme Court case, and it's what you're legally justified to do if you want to pat someone down, if you have reasonable articulable suspicion that someone is engaged in criminal activity, you can detain them for a very brief period of time in order to make sure that they aren't armed and to investigate. And this came up a lot in the Freddie Gray trial, in the Freddie Gray case of the trials of the officers, that it was an argument of whether he was arrested in that long period of detention or whether it was a Terry stop. And the prosecution continued to argue that, and the Department of Justice report backs it up, that it exceeded the norms of a Terry stop, which should be very brief and interrogatory, and then the person is free to go.
And overall, why this is so significant right now, the significance of these findings, among them talking about one individual who was stopped how many dozens of times over just a few years, of course, African American.
Yeah, so there was a guy who was stopped 30 times over the course of the period of the investigation, and none of the stops resulted in any charges, criminal charges, or even traffic citations. And you see this through the report over and over again. Even after excessive force is used, someone will be tased or beaten, punched in the face, and then no charges are ever brought against the individual.
Ralik Hayes, your group, Baltimore Block, released this, leaked this document. How did you get a hold of it? You were the first to put it out.
I'm sorry, I can't actually answer that. We have to protect those that support us in the movement for liberation.
So talk about what your first reaction is in reading it. Do you believe you were the first to see it?
I don't think we were the first, maybe the first locally that are on the grassroots level, but I think we were probably not the first to actually have it. So my first reaction upon reading it was, well, water is wet, right? Like, these are the things that we have been saying for a very long time in this city. I'm not even talking like the decade period in which this report covers, but decades, the entire history of the city from when the city first began and was, doing protective covenants so black people couldn't move in certain neighborhoods. This is the history of the Baltimore Police Department, the culture of the Baltimore Police Department. This didn't just start from zero tolerance under O'Malley. This was bred into the city over decades and decades, and that culminated with zero tolerance, which pretty much gave the officers the ability to act on this culture of racism inside the Baltimore Police Department overtly.
During Wednesday's news conference, Deputy Assistant U.S. Attorney General Vanita Gupta also criticized Baltimore's zero-tolerance policing policy.
But these systemic failures alone didn't cause the problem. The police department's zero-tolerance street enforcement strategy became a quest to produce large numbers of enforcement actions, pedestrian stops in particular, often without enough consideration of their limited impact on solving crime and their caustic damage to community relationships. With today's city leaders, and while today's city's leaders have recognized these issues, many in the BPD continue to follow this strategy. Only 3.7% of the police department's more than 300,000 pedestrian stops from January 2010 to May of 2015 resulted in officers issuing a citation or making an arrest. Many of these stops and the resulting frisks lacked constitutional justification, and many of the discretionary arrests were simply street clearing activities. Supervisors at BPD Central Booking and local prosecutors rejected over 11,000 charges made by BPD officers because they lacked probable cause or otherwise did not merit prosecution.
That's Deputy Assistant U.S. Attorney General Vanita Gupta. Raleigh Hayes, can you respond to what she said?
I think that is extremely accurate. I think that the Baltimore police are a gang. They're domestic terrorists in the way they operate and occupy black communities in Baltimore City. And I know the state's attorney was on News 1 Now this morning trying to say, well, it's just a few bad cops. That is not the case. There is a literal culture in the Baltimore Police Department that indicts the entire system of that department and actually policing everywhere, right? Like firing a few officers is not going to fix these issues. Changing a few policies is not going to fix these issues, right? You can't put a Band-Aid on a cancer wound and expect that the cancer is going to magically disappear, right? Like, you have to remove that, right? And so to do that, we have to take these issues out by the root, which means there's a culture change. There's systemic racism in people's minds, in the officers of Baltimore City Police Department, and we have to deal with that.
I wanted to ask you about the DOJ report finding that Baltimore police, as we know, disproportionately stopped African Americans, whether they're standing, walking, or driving. One chart shows the BPD officers made 520 stops for every 1,000 black residents in Baltimore, but only 180 stops for every 1,000 Caucasian residents. The report also shows African Americans are far more likely to be stopped, multiple times within relatively short periods of time. It reads, quote, African Americans accounted for 95% of the 410 individuals stopped at least 10 times by BPD officers from 2010 to 15. During this period, BPD stopped 34 African Americans at least 20 times and 7 other African Americans at least 30 times. So, Raleigh, what is Baltimore Block calling for?
We will be releasing a press statement later today, but one of the main things we want to mention about the report is that while the report verifies things that we have been saying, we and others, and black citizens in general have been saying for decades. It stops short of describing the trauma that this has placed on communities, right, and the results of that trauma. We also, this also indicts Stephanie Rawlings Blake's leadership as mayor, because this is over her term. And the failed leadership of our elected officials, because we've been saying this and they say, well, it's not that bad. This is not an issue.
Ralik, let me go to Baltimore. Let me go to Baltimore Mayor Stephanie Rawlings Blake, who spoke Wednesday about the DOJ's findings.
The report's assessment and its follow-up to it will help us to heal the relationship between the police and our communities. I also want to be clear that we have not been standing still while this inquiry was underway. Indeed, some of these reforms began before I asked the Department of Justice to investigate the department. The city has taken first steps in a long path to reform, and we've begun to see real benefits. Our police department is already making significant changes. The community is providing valuable insights, and officers and citizens are working together to improve our communities and the policing that is happening within them.
Ralik, your response to what the mayor said?
I think she's a liar. I think that she has no spine when it comes to actually listening to citizens and representing them. I firmly believe that, one, she's a lame duck mayor and she's going to be out of office relatively soon, so any type of commitment on her part is extremely false. I think the reforms are reforms and they're Band-Aid solutions, and they're not going to fix the issues, which is why Block is also calling for the release of all the officers' names who were mentioned in the DOJ report of committing violations, and the firing of all those officers and proof of their firing, because we don't trust Commissioner Davis either.
In one telling anecdote in the New York Times, they talk about a shift commander provided officers with boilerplate language on how to write up trespassing arrest reports of people found near housing projects. The template contained an automatic description of the arrestee, a black male. Ralik.
I think that is the indicator of the fact that the war on drugs and zero tolerance policing is a war on black people, right? Like, it is specifically a war on black people and occupying black communities. As the report shows, that is not even a legal way to stop people, and clearing corners isn't a legal way to stop people, which, for all the things I know about the legal system, I did not actually know that they could not clear corners. I've lived in Baltimore 23 years, and I did not know that. I thought that was a legal practice. So what does that say about the Baltimore City Police Department? What does that say about the things that happen here?
And one really telling thing on that is that the trespassing charges are so often just when someone is standing in front of a property on the sidewalk and not actually on the property at all, on public space. In one case, two black youths were arrested for loitering on their own porch. And so what it really does come across is that the Baltimore Police Department has criminalized blackness by criminalizing public space for black people, so that being black in a public space, or and especially them being black and transgender or black and a woman in public space, becomes criminalized in itself.
And then they also further criminalize those that dissent and speak out against that, particularly organizers and activists in the community. A lot of us have been followed home, car windows broken, tires slashed. In this moment, I would uplift Tawanda Jones, sister of Tyrone West, who they have been fighting for justice for him for 159 weeks. She still gets harassed to this day, right? Like, we're talking over 3 years, and police are still harassing her.
During the Democratic National Convention, I caught up with Maryland Congressmember Elijah Cummings, who represents the 7th Congressional District in Baltimore, and I asked him about policing in Baltimore.
When I talk to police officers in Baltimore, they tell me that they know of people that shouldn't be on the force. The other thing that we have to acknowledge is that black men are dying, that black mothers are afraid for their sons and are afraid for their husbands and nephews. But the fact is that we have to talk together. We have to do what we did at the convention tonight. Had the police present and tell what their concerns are, but at the same time have those people who are simply asking for accountability and respect from the police to be able to voice their concerns, and hopefully we have a mutual thing going on there. The police cannot do their jobs without the cooperation of the community, and the community certainly needs the police, okay?
Have you ever been stopped by the police over the years?
Many times. And keep in mind, as a younger man, I got stopped a lot more as a younger man. I never forget one time I was fortunate enough to get an Acura automobile, and I was being stopped almost every week. I was about 32, and I was being stopped every week.
That's the Congressmember Elijah Cummings speaking about his own experiences. Ralik, as you listen to him, your comments on what's happening at the federal level. He's a congressman. If you're satisfied with what he's doing in his community, in your community in Baltimore.
As of this moment, I am not satisfied with any black elected official that has not signed on for the Vision for Black Lives platform, which is a united front platform from the Moving for Black Lives team built by over 30 organizations. If he wants my support, that's how you get it. As far as his story about constantly getting stopped in Baltimore, that's his story, that's my story, that's the story of every black man and person, really, in Baltimore City, particularly trans folk and black men. We also...
Ralik, how many times have you been stopped?
It has to be over 20 at this point.
On what grounds?
It has to be. There's various times I'll just be walking around my neighborhood and I'll get stopped as, searched, be like, do you live around here? Yes, I do. It is lessened recently, well, not recently, but in the last 3 years or so, because I temporarily served on the Baltimore City Youth Commission, and that's like you're one of the good blacks. We can let you go.
And by comparison, I've been stopped 0 times.
Huh. And Baynard Woods,
most of those don't...
Go ahead, Ralik.
Most of those, I can honestly say, probably never exist on paper. I never got a citation. I may have gotten 2 citizen citations and a few traffic stops in my life, but the rest of them are directly informal interactions.
And finally, Baynard Woods, you've looked at particularly gender bias and trans bias on the part of the police. Explain.
Yeah, so there are just some horrible allegations in the report. They don't go as far as saying that gender bias violates federal law, but then they point out a number of areas that they find very troubling in terms of gender bias. I mean, in one case, the report cites a police officer who was regularly having sex with a sex worker for U.S. currency and for immunity from prosecution. There are cases where they're not investigating sexual assault claims. A member of the state's attorney's office calls a woman who had made a sexual assault report a conniving whore, and the police officer writes back, LMAO, I agree. And another police officer said that who was dealing with sexual assault crimes, that we don't have any victims and all our cases are, and then he uses a unradio-friendly expletive, but it's just a systematic, and I think if you separated that out, you would find that many of those cases, they don't look at race and gender together, but many of those cases are black women, and that trans women being in a place, in an area like a bus stop, and just being there can be suspicion of soliciting or prostitution. So it takes that loitering aspect and pushes it another step further in really criminalizing being in public as an African American in Baltimore.
Well, we're going to...
Actually, you said something...
Go ahead, Ralik, and we're going to wrap up with your comment.
You said something really key, right, which is like the collusion between the state's attorney office, and I'd also add the FOP in there and how it, pretty much provide amnesty for these officers.
The Fraternal Order of Police.
They don't allow the transparency necessary for accountability, which is why we also would really like a DOJ investigation into the state's attorney's office, and the FOP should be divested from immediately.
I want to thank you both for being with us. We will certainly continue to follow this story. Baynard Woods is a journalist who writes for The Guardian. We'll link to your pieces. And Ralik Hayes, activist coordinator of Baltimore Bloc, speaking to us from Baltimore. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, We look at Roger Ailes and what will happen to Fox News and a new investigation into the NRA. We'll be speaking with Vanity Fair's Sarah Ellison. Stay with us.
Did you see him? Or did you hear him as he screamed in pain? Brother caught it on the telephone, frame by frame. Could you see him? Could you feel him as a man? Could you see him as a man like you know? Oh, never looking for a problem as the day goes by, but the trouble just around the corner there lies in waiting. On the boundaries where we live lies a land that takes and gives us nothing.
Blues for Freddie Gray by Lafayette Gilchrist here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we turn to the crisis engulfing Fox News, as further revelations about former chief Roger Ailes have raised questions about how much the company was aware of his transgressions. Ailes has now been accused of sexual harassment by more than 20 women, including Fox News anchor Megyn Kelly, former anchor Gretchen Carlson. Earlier this week, another former Fox News host also accused Ailes of sexual harassment. Andrea Tantaro says she repeatedly reported Ailes' harassment to senior Fox executives last year. She says she was demoted and then taken off the air. The former director of booking at Fox News has said Ailes sexually harassed her and tortured her for 2 decades. Lori Loon told New York Magazine that Fox News knew about the harassment and helped cover it up. She said the harassment amounted to psychological torture and ruined her life. Loon called Ailes a predator and said her duties included luring young female Fox employees into one-on-one situations with Ailes that she knew could result in harassment. New York Magazine has also reported Ailes ran his own black room operation out of Fox News, in which he used Fox money to hire private detectives and political operatives who carried out Ailes' personal campaigns, including targeting journalists. The magazine reports Ailes sent private detectives to follow around multiple journalists who'd been reporting on him. Ailes has denied all the allegations against him. He resigned in July, receiving a $40 million severance package. Rupert Murdoch has stepped in as interim chief of Fox News. To talk more about these revelations, we're joined by Sarah Ellison, Vanity Fair contributing editor. Her most recent piece is an exclusive headlined Inside the Fox News Bunker. It exposed the existence of explosive audio tapes recorded by multiple women in conversation with Ailes. Sarah Ellison is also the author of War at the Wall Street Journal, Inside the Struggle to Control an American Business Empire. She worked for 10 years at the Wall Street Journal in Paris, London, and New York. Welcome to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
So, take us inside the Fox bunker.
Well, right now inside Fox News, of course, the organization is without its longtime leader, Roger Ailes, and that divides the newsroom. That used to be that there were sort of Ailes loyalists who were very unhappy to see him go, and then people who professed a lot of professional relief that he was gone. The pro-Ailes camp is shrinking as more and more women come forward, but I think that a lot of what they're wondering now is what are they going to learn from the internal investigation that has been launched to look into these allegations.
So for people who aren't following it very much,
sure,
lay out all of these revelations that have come out, and also what you have found, explosive audio tapes.
Right. I mean, I think you gave an excellent summary of the various women who have come forward. Roger Ailes was, he was forced to resign in July, and he received a very large settlement payout from the company. What I found in my reporting is that Gretchen Carlson, who was the woman who initially brought the first lawsuit against Roger Ailes, is in discussions now with the company, 21st Century Fox, which owns Fox News, about an 8-figure settlement. And in those settlement discussions, that's where the tapes came out. The idea that there are these explosive tapes with that have recorded conversations between Roger Ailes and multiple women, including Gretchen Carlson. What's ironic about that is that Roger Ailes was sort of known for taping other people, that he was very worried about secrecy, that he did always feel that other people were spying on him, and he was worried about that. I mean, there was a wooden door outside of his office. In order to be able to get in, you couldn't see through the door as you would be in a normal executive's office. Everyone who was approaching walking down the hallway to his office was caught on a camera. But the question of what is in these tapes and whether or not they become public and how they would become public is really at the center now of this settlement discussion, which is very tense.
And explain who is investigating all of this.
So 21st Century Fox asked Paul Weiss, which is a large New York powerful law firm, to do an internal investigation into the claims that were brought by Gretchen Carlson. And they have brought a number of women in to speak to them about what they experienced, and that's how the Megyn Kelly revelations came out. That's how many of the women, when we talk about 20 women, that's where we're getting that number from, the number of women who have either contacted the investigation or been heard by them. That investigation is a very powerful tool for the company, and namely the sons of Rupert Murdoch, James and Lachlan Murdoch, who are professing to want to really clean up the culture of Fox News and make it a trusting workplace, a 21st century workplace where women and everybody else can feel safe. And so the company now is dealing with this very strange conundrum where the man who made this Fox News organization a huge powerhouse, and whether you liked it or didn't, you had to admit that it was an incredibly powerful news organization. Their shareholders want them to keep it exactly the way that it was. All the human beings who work there would like it to change. And so this is something that they're sort of grappling with right now.
So he's getting $40 million yes. In a settlement. And we learned that because for a brief moment,
yes.
Well, explain what happened, how Matt Drudge got a hold of the settlement as they were working it out. Roger Ailes wasn't even kicked out of the place yet.
I mean, this is several weeks ago in the course of a very tense last week, before Roger Ailes had officially resigned. There was a report about Megyn Kelly talking to the internal investigation about how she had been sexually harassed by Roger Ailes. In response to that report, Roger Ailes' attorney wanted to put out a statement debunking what Megyn Kelly had said and saying she's thanked me many times, we have a wonderful relationship. And instead of sending that statement to the Drudge Report, they sent a draft agreement that had the $40 million figure in it. So, of course, everyone who has been reporting on this was whiplashed because they thought, oh, wait, what is this? Why is Drudge getting an early report that he then very quickly took down because he was contacted by people begging him to sort of take it down, that it was a mistaken leak. I mean, it's in the midst of all these grisly headlines, it's a very funny moment, in fact, because you have someone who's trying to spin against someone's sexual harassment claims, and instead they end up putting their own settlement package right out there for the rest of us to see.
Earlier this week, CNN's Brian Stelter said he was spied on by a Fox News staffer.
Right.
About 10 years ago, I had a crush on a woman at Fox News. She was a low-level staffer. I was in college at the time. So I was going out with what I thought were dates, because I thought these were dates. These were not dates. She was actually reporting back to Fox News about me. She was reporting back what I thought of her and about CNN and MSNBC and Fox. Because I was a reporter on the beat, they were actually spying on me that way. Now, I didn't think that was a big deal at the time. I thought it was the way Fox operates. Fox is a political organization. Yeah. But now we know they were actually sending out private investigators. They were following reporters around. I mean, we knew covering.
So, wow, that's CNN's Brian Stelter, who formerly was at the New York Times. Explain this, Sarah.
Well, there are other journalists who've come out with similar sort of stories. I mean, Brian Stelter, John Cook at Gawker. Gabriel Sherman is probably the person who's received the most attention in this way. He worked on a biography of Roger Ailes for years, and Ailes made a comment there's a report out this week that Ailes had commented to someone that I could send someone over to his house and get him beaten up. And, Gabe Sherman and his wife had their apartment swept for bugs. The question about what Ailes did, there are the sexual harassment claims, but then there's the question of At what point does any of this kind of alleged behavior become illegal and criminal, as opposed to something that would be brought up in a civil lawsuit? And I think that the overall intimidation. I mean, Fox News always was an intimidating place to cover and to write about, and journalists sort of knew that. They knew that there was a possibility. I mean, in addition to getting an angry phone call, there were other reporters who had negative, anonymous stories leaked about them and smeared. I mean, there was a story many years ago of a reporter who had gone into drug rehab, and that was leaked by Fox News' PR department. I mean, it's sort of unthinkable in terms of the way that they allegedly operated. And now what we have, I mean, what's interesting is this Gretchen Carlson lawsuit has sort of broken the dam. Everyone is now able to come forward with their stories, and it's sort of what a culture of fear looks like when it finally breaks down.
And it implicates so many.
Exactly.
Explain who it implicates, like Andrea Tantaros, who said she went to higher ups. She named those higher ups.
Right. I mean, so there's obviously Roger Ailes is out of the building now, and everyone is aiming most of their attacks at Roger Ailes. But he also had a lot of people under him, and there are a lot of questions about how willing those people were to follow his orders, how active they were in kind of in enforcing what it was that he wanted them to do, what they exactly knew. That's the one level. Then the other level is above him. What did people at the parent company, Rupert Murdoch's 21st Century Fox, what did those people know? I mean, I was just speaking with someone who said, this Lori Loon settlement that we keep talking about, this $3.15 million.
Now, she was the so-called booker.
She was a Fox News booker, and she's the person who told New York Magazine that over the course of 20 years, she was essentially Roger Ailes' sex slave. And what she reported other executives inside of Fox News that knew of, that would call her to New York. Bill Shine is the person that she mentioned specifically. There's a general counsel.
He's the Fox executive vice president.
Exactly. He was sort of Ailes' number two. Diane Brandy is the general counsel who drew up the settlement arrangement with Lori Loon. Those people are and others. I mean, there are other unofficial sort of, they're less official sort of quote unquote friends of Rogers, who are people that were on the payroll or who were on sort of monthly retainers, that no one in the building really knew exactly what they did. But Ailes sort of had them. I mean, there's an allegation now, another story that came out that he was using those people to run these kinds of campaigns, whether they were smearing journalists or going after other enemies.
People like Bo Dietl.
Exactly. And those people are leaving. I mean, those people are being dismissed now. And so that's part of the effort that Rupert Murdoch is engaged in at this moment to kind of get rid of those people. But the point that I want to make about the settlement is that when you ask people at 21st Century Fox and Fox News why that wasn't reported and why that didn't raise eyebrows, they say, well, at a division like Fox News, which brings in $1 billion of profits, that's a rounding error, $3.15 million. I mean,
and how many of these are there?
Well, there are two questions. One is that how many $3 million settlements do you need in order for it to register? How many are there out there? That can't be the only settlement that is in existence. But companies decide all the time what is material and what is not. Material is this term that public companies like to use in terms of they just get to decide what they think is important. Much larger companies than Fox News disclose much smaller settlements than $3.15 million. So at a certain point, people above Ailes and other people have to answer for that.
And Lori Loon, a broken woman, I mean, for 20 years, as you described it, his sex slave, and then told to lure in young women from Fox to bring them into a one-on-one situation with Roger Ailes.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we still don't know the extent to which and the way that which Roger Ailes enticed people to do the things that they're accusing him of, right? So I have heard stories about how he could also be at turns very charming. I mean, this is the case with any kind of charismatic leader. They have a side to them that can be very compelling and charismatic. But what we've heard, what we've heard in the past 6 weeks or so is a very different story, and it's one where he was largely terrifying people, and they were either too scared to speak out, or they were actually doing what it was that he was telling them to do, and also too scared to speak out.
We're going to go to break. I also want to ask you about his lawyer, very unusual, Susan Estrich. They were foes many years ago when Susan Estrich was the campaign manager for Michael Dukakis and Roger Ailes worked for his opponent, George H.W. Bush. We're talking to Sarah Ellison, who is Vanity Fair contributing editor. She's written many pieces on this, including Inside the Fox News Bunker, and most recently wrote a piece about the NRA, the civil war that could doom the NRA. But we'll continue on what ails Fox. Is it more than Roger? Stay with us.
I would have returned your greeting if it weren't for the way you were looking at me. This street is not a market, and I am not a commodity. And don't you find it sad that we can't even say hello? 'Cause you're a man and I'm a woman, and the sun is getting low. And there are some places that I can't go. As a woman I can't go there, and as a person I don't care. I don't go for the hey baby, what's your name? And I'd like to go alone, thank you, just the same. I am up again against the skin of my guitar in the window of my life, looking out.
The Story by Ani DeFranco here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Before Roger Ailes headed Fox News, he was a top Republican operative. I want to turn to the documentary Above the Fray, The Lessons of Dukakis' '88, about the 1988 presidential race, where Roger Ailes played a key role. This begins with the infamous Willie Horton ad George W. Bush ran against Michael Dukakis.
Dukakis not only opposes the death penalty, he allowed first-degree murderers to have weekend passes from prison. One was Willie Horton. Despite a life sentence, Horton received 10 weekend passes from prison. Horton fled, kidnapped a young couple, stabbing the man and repeatedly raping his girlfriend. Weekend prison passes. Dukakis on crime.
Now, it was a so-called independent committee that started running these ads. Independent committees are not supposed to be in touch with the campaigns. I think Roger Ailes had talked to the guy or the people who were producing the Willie Horton commercial for the so-called independent committee many, many times. So the notion that there was no collaboration between the two was nonsense.
That was Michael Dukakis, remember, the former governor of Massachusetts, ran for president in '88, speaking in the documentary Above the Fray. Interestingly, his campaign manager in 1988, Susan Estrich, is now Roger Ailes' personal attorney. The development that has shocked many, in part because Estrich is also a prominent feminist legal scholar. In 1991, Susan Estrich wrote in the Stanford Law Review, "It should be obvious that the system already contains serious disincentives to women filing sexual harassment complaints. Start with embarrassment, loss of privacy, and sometimes shame. If the woman remains employed, she faces the prospect that her harasser and others will make her life impossible. If she's quit or been fired, the danger is that she will be branded a troublemaker and find it difficult to find another job." Again, those are the words of Susan Estrich, who also wrote the book Real Rape: How the Legal System Victimized Women Who Say No. Our guest is Sarah Ellison, writes for Vanity Fair, before that Wall Street Journal, as Rupert Murdoch was taking it over. You worked there for 10 years.
I worked there for 10 years before he took over the paper. So
your response, quite a choice for a lawyer and quite a choice for Susan Estrich to make to represent Roger Ailes.
Well, Susan Estrich had become a Fox News contributor, and I don't know exactly how they became so close after having been opponents, but obviously it's a genius choice for Ailes for his attorney, given that he knew that he had to know that he was going to be facing additional women and additional allegations and complaints. And Susan has done nothing but defend him the whole way. And you said earlier, he has denied all of these allegations. We do have to keep that in mind, that he has said that all of this is true, all of these women are lying, and that he proclaims his innocence in all these cases.
I just want to correct. I said that he worked with George W. Bush. Of course, it was George H.W. Bush at the time who ran against Michael Dukakis. So, Susan, Sarah, you've been looking at all of these issues, looking at what's going to happen right now. Roger Ailes is out, but what happens to the newsroom? What happens to the Fox bunker and the role it will play?
Well, I mean, this is the question that people inside the company have is what will happen now that this genius newsman is out? Obviously, the women who are bringing complaints against him are quite happy that he is gone. I think a lot of the people who were intimidated and frightened by him are also happy that he is gone. The two younger Murdoch sons who are now running the company, James Murdoch, and the CEO, and Lachlan Murdoch, his older brother, who's the chairman, have talked about wanting to modernize the culture inside Fox News and the entire company, make it a much more trusting and open workplace. Their investors don't, as investors do, they don't really care about human beings. They just want the profits to continue to come in. So they're walking a very fine line of how to manage this crisis. They want to get it behind them. They want to not continue to have these women continuing to come out, which is why they're trying to launch these settlement discussions with Gretchen Carlson and sort of get everything behind them.
Now, though you worked at Wall Street Journal before Murdoch took over, you wrote a book, War at the Wall Street Journal, Inside the Struggle to Control an American Business Empire. So what do you predict, given your investigations of how Murdoch runs an operation?
I mean, I think that what's going to end up happening, this will continue on for some time. They've tried to deal with it very quickly. They've dealt with it much more quickly than the last time you and I were talking about a Murdoch scandal, which was the phone hacking scandal in London, where the company was sort of systemically listening to people's voicemails and then using that information to blackmail them to either give them other information or printing that.
Explain that briefly for those who don't remember the scandal of News of the World.
So that was a scandal that was about 5 years ago, and it centered on Murdoch's London newspapers, British newspapers, and what the reporters there were doing. They were listening into voicemails of people that they wanted to write about, and then using those private voicemails to either print stories about those people based on those voicemails, or use that information, take that information to those people and say, we have this piece of information. We're going to print it unless you can give us a better story. And what that created was an enormous environment of fear. Even to think that, the question, and I think this is also part of the way that Roger Ailes operated, is that whether or not he was spying on you or whether or not he was going to retaliate against you, people were very convinced that he could and that he would do that. And so that created, it was an entire environment of fear.
And wasn't James Murdoch implicated in News of the World, that whole story? James and Lachlan, now the sons of Murdoch, who are running Fox.
Right. James was running the European he was overseeing the British newspapers at that point. I mean, he had a sort of bigger job than that, but he was right in the center of that scandal. They dealt with that scandal very differently. They kept having internal investigations that would clear everyone except for a few bad Apple employees, and then they would move on, and then there would be new headlines, largely in the Guardian newspaper, that would come up with a new example of phone hacking. And James was dragged before Parliament with his father to testify about this. He was largely seen as somebody who was implicated in it, although saved in the end by, we still don't know exactly what that situation, how far it went up. But he was cleared, and Rebecca Brooks, who was the other top executive who was running the British newspapers, was also cleared. And so what Rupert Murdoch did that was masterful about that scandal was sort of sacrificed his lower-level employees to save his son and himself and his favorite executive.
We're going to have to leave it there, but we're going to continue the conversation and also look at the piece you just wrote in Vanity Fair, The Civil War That Could Doom the NRA. And we'll post it online at democracynow.org. Sarah Ellison is Vanity Fair contributing editor. We'll link to her piece, Inside the Fox News Bunker, also author of War at the Wall Street Journal, Inside the Struggle to Control an American Business Empire. She also worked at the Wall Street Journal. That does it for our broadcast. Check our website, democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for joining us.